You've probably been involved with someone who seemed available at the beginning. Long conversations, constant presence, clear interest. But little by little, something started to change. When you brought up plans, they dodged the topic. When you talked about the future, they got uncomfortable. When the connection began to ask for a bit more clarity, distance appeared. Silence. Or that classic line, I don't know if I'm ready for this. Or maybe, you're that person. Maybe you get excited at the start, like the idea of being with someone, but feel a strange tightness when you realize the other person is becoming too important. You start thinking about everything that could go wrong. You feel the urge to have space, to pull back a little, even without knowing how to explain why. And the most confusing part is that it's not a lack of feeling. It's not a lack of attraction. It's not a lack of connection. What's missing is a sense of calm when the relationship stops being just a possibility and becomes real. This is often called fear of commitment, but anyone who lives it knows that phrase explains very little because it's not fear of loving, it's something more complex, and we're going to explore that in this video. If any of these scenes felt familiar, you may have been inside this story longer than you realize. When someone has a fear of commitment, the problem rarely shows up at the beginning. Quite the opposite. The early stage is usually easy, light, even exciting. These people know how to connect. They know how to talk, how to create intimacy quickly. And that's what confuses the person on the other side. Nothing seems to suggest that anything will go wrong. The discomfort begins when the relationship shifts into a new phase. There's no exact moment, but you feel it. Conversations become more serious. The other person starts sharing things that matter. Expectations begin to appear even if no one says them out loud, and that's when something tightens internally. For the person experiencing this, the feeling isn't, I don't want you. It's closer to something here is trapping me. A strange weight, a restlessness that's hard to explain. As if the relationship were moving too fast, even when objectively it isn't. Many of these people start looking for flaws where they didn't see any before. Small things begin to irritate them. There's a diffuse sense of annoyance, a desire to create space. Sometimes the feeling turns into doubt, other times into emotional distance, but internally what's happening is an unconscious attempt to relieve pressure. Because commitment isn't just being together. Commitment implies permanence and continuity. It means the relationship is no longer disposable, and that activates something deep. For someone who fears real emotional attachment, closeness doesn't bring only comfort, it brings exposure. The closer the other person gets, the more they feel seen. And being truly seen is risky. It means that the less organized, less secure, unresolved parts might come into view. There's also a quiet fantasy that often accompanies this fear, the idea that commitment equals loss of freedom. As if being in a relationship automatically meant giving up yourself, as if choosing one person meant closing every other possible door, even when no one is demanding that. This kind of thinking is rarely conscious. The person doesn't wake up thinking, I'm going to run because I'm afraid. What they feel is discomfort, a desire to slow things down, to keep everything open, to avoid defining too much. That's why they often prefer relationships that never fully deepen, relationships full of intensity but with little structure, where there's emotion but no foundation, where there's always a visible exit. This explains why some people live in repeating cycles. They get close, get involved, then pull back. They distance themselves when the other person starts asking for clarity, and later they miss them. Sometimes they return, sometimes they repeat the pattern with someone new. What's interesting is that this fear doesn't come from a lack of desire for connection. It comes from the opposite. These people feel deeply. They do get emotionally involved, but they don't trust their own ability to sustain what they feel once it starts to require consistency. There's also a quiet fear of failing, of not being enough, of not being able to maintain the other person's interest over time. Commitment turns the relationship into something continuous, and that removes the sense of control. At the beginning, everything is possibility. Later, everything carries consequences. For someone who fears commitment, consequences are what feel threatening, because consequences imply emotional responsibility. They mean your choices affect someone else, that your distance can hurt, that your indecision isn't neutral. And dealing with that requires a level of emotional maturity that hasn't always been developed. Many of these people learned at some point in life that deep bonds bring pain, that getting too attached can be costly. So they developed a way to protect themselves, staying close enough not to feel alone, but never close enough to feel trapped. The problem is that this balance rarely holds for long. Sooner or later, the relationship asks for definition. And when that happens, the fear surfaces with force, not as explicit panic, but as the urge to escape, to delay, to keep everything undefined. And that's exactly where relationships begin to fall apart. Not because of a lack of love, but because of an excess of fear. This fear isn't about the other person, it's about what the relationship activates internally. And understanding that completely changes how this behavior needs to be seen. From here on, we'll go deeper into this dynamic. which becomes even clearer when we look at what these people experience when they're alone, away from any relationship. When these people are alone, something curious happens. The fear of commitment doesn't disappear. It simply changes form. From a distance, the relationship feels safer. The person misses the other, idealizes, replays conversations, thinks about what could have been different. Sometimes they even convince themselves that now they'd be ready to try again, because far from real closeness, the bond no longer demands continuous presence. This is where many confusions are born. When alone, they crave connection. When close, they feel the urge to escape. And this back and forth creates emotional exhaustion, both for the person living it and for anyone who gets involved with them. The problem isn't wanting freedom, it's needing it precisely when someone starts to matter. For someone who fears commitment, solitude is ambivalent. It's uncomfortable, but also calming. There's no pressure, no direct expectation, no immediate risk of disappointing someone. They can feel longing without having to sustain consistency. That's why many of these people feel calmer when everything stays undefined. When there's someone there, but nothing is clearly established. When there's connection, but no promise. This in-between space feels safe because it allows control. But that control comes at a cost. The person ends up living relationships where they're never fully in and never fully out. Always observing. Always monitoring whether they're too comfortable, too involved, too close. And this internal vigilance drains emotional energy. There's also a specific fear that's rarely said out loud. The fear of being needed. Not in the romantic sense of the word, but in the sense of being someone the other person emotionally depends on. For someone who struggles with commitment, the idea of being deeply important to someone else creates anxiety. Being important means you can hurt someone. It means your choices leave marks. It means you can't simply disappear without consequences. And that feels heavy. That's why these people often prefer being desired over being needed. They prefer the enchantment of the beginning to the stability of the middle. Because in the beginning, everything is reversible. Nothing is too binding yet. Another delicate point is that fear of commitment usually comes with a very convincing internal narrative. The person tells themselves they just haven't met the right one, that they need more time, that they don't want to tie themselves to something that might not work. These thoughts aren't conscious lies. They make sense to the person experiencing them. The problem is that they always appear at the same moment, when the relationship starts to ask for ongoing presence, not just emotion. This creates a cycle that's hard to break. The person gets involved, feels something real, pulls away when the relationship deepens, misses the other when they're apart, and then repeats the pattern. Each repetition reinforces the idea that commitment equals discomfort. Gradually, the fear stops being just a reaction and becomes part of identity. The person starts defining themselves as hard to be with, too independent, not made for long-term relationships. These labels feel protective, but they also limit. Because deep down, what's missing isn't the ability to love. It's trust in their own ability to sustain love once it stops being light. To sustain means staying even when the spark fluctuates, even when flaws are seen, even when the relationship requires conversation, adjustment, frustration. For someone who equates love with constant intensity, this phase feels like a sign that something is wrong. But it isn't. It's transition. And it's precisely in this transition that fear of commitment shows up most strongly, not as rejection of the other person, but as resistance to what the relationship now demands internally. Understanding this begins to shift the question. It's no longer, why does this person run? It becomes, what are they trying to protect themselves from when they run? That answer doesn't come right away, but it starts to take shape when we look more closely at the emotional history behind this fear, and at the kind of bond this person learned to experience as safe. That's what begins to emerge when we look deeper. Before we continue, a quick request. If this topic is resonating with you, or if you've lived something similar from either side of a relationship, leave a like on the video. It helps this kind of content reach people who may need to hear exactly this. Now let's continue. There's an important detail about fear of commitment that's rarely noticed. It doesn't show up only in romantic relationships. It appears whenever something starts to require emotional continuity, or whenever a choice stops being easily reversible. These people are often great at beginnings. They start projects, ideas, conversations, relationships. Starting isn't the problem. Sustaining is. Staying when the initial excitement gives way to repetition, emotional routine, and predictability. In relationships, this becomes clear when the other person starts to occupy real space in their life. Not just as someone interesting, but as someone who matters. Someone who expects. Someone who notices shifts in mood, absence, and inconsistency. That's when the person with fear of commitment begins to feel too seen. Not literally, but emotionally. As if they're being called to be more whole, more consistent, more emotionally responsible than they can manage at that moment. This creates a strong internal tension. On one side, there's the desire for closeness. On the other, the impulse to create distance in order not to feel swallowed. Often, this conflict turns into confusing behavior, getting very close one day and pulling away the next, showing affection and then becoming cold, talking about plans and then acting as if nothing was ever defined. For the person on the other side, this can be devastating. It creates hope and insecurity at the same time, the feeling that something exists but never fully takes shape. For the person living with fear of commitment, it's painful too. There's guilt, there's confusion, there's the sense of always disappointing someone or disappointing themselves. Another rarely discussed point is that these people often idealize love, not in a cliched romantic way, but in the belief that the right relationship won't trigger this kind of discomfort, that when it's the right person, everything will flow without fear, doubt, or the urge to escape. This expectation creates a serious problem. Any sign of discomfort is interpreted as proof that something is wrong. Instead of being seen as a natural part of building a bond, discomfort becomes a warning sign, and so the person pulls away, not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much and don't know what to do with it. There's also difficulty letting go of fantasy. At the beginning, relationships allow projection. The other person hasn't shown all their flaws yet. The relationship hasn't demanded hard choices. When that phase passes, the bond becomes more real and less controllable. For someone with fear of commitment, losing control is frightening. It means admitting the relationship could fail, that there could be pain, that there could be disappointment, and most of all, that there's no clean exit. So escape becomes a temporary solution. Creating distance feels easier than moving through uncertainty. Keeping everything undefined feels safer than choosing. The problem is that this strategy blocks something essential: the experience of a relationship that matures, a bond that moves through phases without needing to be perfect or intense all the time. Without that experience, the fear is never truly confronted. It only gets reinforced. Each withdrawal confirms the belief that commitment is suffocating. Each interrupted relationship feeds the idea that something always goes wrong once things get serious. But what's failing isn't the relationship itself. It's the tolerance for what the relationship awakens internally. And this is where the issue stops being about the other person and becomes something deeper: the individual's relationship with vulnerability, emotional dependence, and permanence. In the next block, this becomes even clearer when we look at what these people learned over the course of their lives about attachment and emotional safety, and why commitment came to be associated with risk rather than refuge. When we look more deeply, fear of commitment stops looking like a relationship problem and starts revealing something older, something learned, something that was built long before any romantic relationship. For many of these people, closeness was never a completely safe place. At some point in their history, emotional proximity came paired with instability, unpredictability, or pain. Not necessarily something dramatic or traumatic. Sometimes it was simply the ongoing sense that getting attached meant becoming too exposed. The result is a very specific kind of emotional adaptation. The person learns how to connect without anchoring, to care without depending, to always keep an exit route available. This works as long as the relationship stays light, but it collapses when the bond begins to require continuity. Commitment, in this context, isn't experienced as something built together. It's experienced as risk, as something that could take away control, autonomy, or emotional balance. And when risk is perceived, the natural response is self-protection. That protection doesn't show up as coldness, it shows up as doubt, as confusion, as gradual distancing, as that feeling that something isn't right, even when rationally everything seems fine. The hardest part is that in many cases, these people want to be in relationships. They're not running from love, they're running from the vulnerability that real love requires. The exposure that comes when the other person truly starts to matter. As long as the relationship feels reversible, everything seems possible. When it begins to ask for permanence, the body reacts. Not because the other person is wrong, but because the bond has activated emotional memories that haven't yet been processed. That's why understanding fear of commitment isn't about convincing someone to stay. It's about recognizing that for some people, staying has always meant losing something important. Losing control, losing stability, losing the sense of being safe within themselves. This recognition changes everything. It takes the behavior out of the realm of judgment and places it in the realm of understanding, not to justify patterns that cause harm, but to understand where they come from, and from there open space for different choices. Because fear of commitment isn't a life sentence, it's a signal that certain emotional experiences still haven't found a place. A signal that the person may need to learn, perhaps for the first time, that closeness doesn't have to mean invasion and that attachment doesn't have to mean imprisonment. This learning doesn't happen quickly and it doesn't happen alone. It requires awareness, a willingness to sit with discomfort, and often support to reorganize the way intimacy is experienced. But it is possible. When that process begins, something shifts in how relationships are perceived. Commitment stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a choice. Staying stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like something built together. The other person stops being a risk and starts becoming a partner. And even if that path still isn't clear, understanding the mechanism behind the fear is already an important step, because what can be named loses some of its power to quietly control decisions. If this video helped you understand this pattern better, in yourself or in someone you've been involved with, consider subscribing to the channel. The goal here is to keep exploring human behavior with depth, without oversimplifying and without turning everything into a label. Understanding is the first step toward choosing differently.